From the Folger Shakespeare Library, this is Shakespeare Unlimited. I'm Farah Kareem Cooper, the Folger Director. For many families, the holidays revolve around food. Perhaps in your family, you see the same recipes every year, like green bean casserole, gingerbread cookies, or eggnog. Some we can't wait to taste each year, and others might be ready for retirement. According to food historian Sam Bilton, if you're looking to liven up your holiday table, you should consider adding an Elizabethan dish. Maybe try a carbonado of veal, a mince pie, or a pear frangipane tart. In her new book, Much Ado About Cooking, Bilton explores the surprisingly varied diet of early modern England. Bilton's previous books covered the histories of chocolate, saffron, and gingerbread. She's also the host of the podcast Comfortably Hungry. Here's Sam Bilton in conversation with Barbara Bogave.
There is a lot of food, it turns out, in Shakespeare's plays. I mean, they're just, right? There's banquets and feasts and endless food metaphors.
Yeah, it's actually a wealth of food in his plays, and you don't really think about it until you start looking for it. That's the thing, it sort of glosses over it almost when you're watching a play. You don't necessarily think, oh, that's a food reference, but there is a lot of food in his plays.
Yeah, that's true. It does. It just seems to be like a kind of scene setting. And as I was reading your book, I was thinking, oh, there's so many quotes that are so wonderful that I didn't really pay that much attention to in the theater or while reading. And for instance, one of my favorite ones is, let the sky rain potatoes. Let it thunder to the tune of green sleeves, hail kissing comfits, and snow. Is it eringos?
Eringos, yes.
Yeah, which is what? Meringues? I don't know what that is.
No, no, it's not meringues. It would be nice if it were meringues. No, eringos are the root of the sea holly plant. And it had a reputation for being an aphrodisiac. So it's not something you can go to a supermarket now and pick up, but you would have probably been able to get it from an apothecary in Shakespeare's day.
Right, with your ginseng and horn of whatever.
Yeah.
And a lot of the food, we're going to get to that, a lot of the food references involve aphrodisiacs.
Yes.
But that's a great one. That ends, let there come a tempest of provocation, speaking of aphrodisiacs, and it's from the Merry Wives of Windsor. Because early modern people had such a different understanding of food and eating, and it was still all based on the humors, right? That food had their own humoral qualities.
Yeah, and that's one of the joys and tricky things about reading food in Shakespeare, because something that's mentioned may not have the same meaning today as it did then, because as you say, if they were really concerned about what they ate, because what you ate could really affect your complexion, as they called it. The four humours, so your black bile, yellow bile, phlegm, and blood, that made up your complexion, your not personality, but your physical well-being. And if they weren't balanced, and it was very easy to throw them out of balance if you overindulged in a particular foodstuff, for example, then it could play havoc, potentially.
Right, it could affect your exercise and your sleep and your excretions.
Yes.
The whole deal. Which is, I mean, it's not so different from our time, but did everyday people really think that much about these things, though? I mean, what I'm thinking is most days, people were just struggling just to eat anything, right?
Well, this is the thing, so your everyday person in Shakespeare's day, they were just more concerned about getting bread to fill their bellies. They weren't really worried about they were worried about whether they could afford meat, because most people couldn't afford meat, and if they had it, it was a rare treat.
And well-off people really did eat a dizzying array of meats and of proteins at a meal, didn't? I mean, meals were pretty different in Shakespeare's time, too.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the hardest thing for people to get their heads around, because we talk about courses today and we think we might have a main course and then a dessert. all separate. We'd eat one, finish it, and then go on to the next course. But a course in Shakespeare's day would consist of many dishes, so many dishes. And also, there wouldn't be a delineation between sweet and savoury. I mean, quite a lot of dishes in this period combine the sort of the dried fruits, for example, and spices with meat. So a mince pie is a classic example, for example, where you have originally you had dried fruit and meat like mutton all mixed together in the pastry case and served up. And that was perfectly normal. But within a course, you might have a mince pie served alongside a joint of venison or beef, and then also a custard put on the table. And that's just the beginning of it. If you were serving a big feast, there was none of this, can you pass the custard down to the other end of the table? You ate what was in front of you. So if you wanted custard with your beef and it happened to be in front of you, that's great. But if the beef was at the other end of the table, you just had to put up with the neats, for example, that was in front of you instead.
Well, I think you list at one point beef, mutton, veal, lamb, kid, pork, rabbit, capon, red or fallow deer, various fish, and wildfowl.
Yeah.
It's just all...
And that's just one course. And that would be taken away and another course would come out with a similar array of dishes.
It's dizzying, yes. Let's talk about fish, because I had no real idea about this. So fish was a big part of the early modern diet and, of course, prescribed by religion even after the Reformation. So Fridays and Saturdays were set aside to eat fish. But Elizabeth I added Wednesdays. What was that about?
Okay, so the Reformation occurred under Elizabeth's father, Henry VIII. And in a way, we sort of relaxed our attitude to what we could and couldn't eat, the fasting and feasting days of the year, because we no longer were a Catholic nation. The downside of that was we didn't necessarily need as much fish. So there weren't necessarily as many people going out to fish. And that was an issue for Elizabeth I because she needed the manpower to power her navy. It is believed that one of the reasons that she instigated this extra day was we needed people to be going out fishing so that they would have sailors that could operate the ships that went out and fought the Armada, for example. So that was why. It was less to do with religion.
So supporting the fishing industry in order to support her military aims.
Yeah.
That's wild.
Yeah, it was very little to do with religion by Elizabeth's reign.
Okay, were there actual cookbooks towards the end of the 16th century? And who had them when so few people were literate and books were so expensive? I mean, Mistress Quickly wouldn't have had one, for instance.
No, Mistress Quickly definitely wouldn't have had a cookbook. So the short answer is yes, they absolutely did have cookbooks, like the Good Housewife's Handmaid for the Kitchen and the Housewife's Jewel, which was by Thomas Dawson. They came out at the end of the 16th century. And then just over into the 17th century, you had Hugh Platt's Delights for Ladies, which is...
They're, of course, all male authors.
They're all male. At this point, they are all male authors.
Mansplaining housewifery.
Yes. I mean, they are most definitely men. And actually, the Hugh Platt book, Delights for Ladies, it mostly deals with the candying and confectionery, because that was, even in well-to-do households, that was overseen by the lady of the house because sugar was so expensive. You know, so if they were candying stuff, like ginger root, for example, was a popular thing to candy, or orange peels, or making marmalades made from Seville oranges or quinces largely. But they would have required a huge quantity of this incredibly expensive sugar. Sugar was used largely as a spice, especially in savoury recipes.
And so spices like sugar, and sugar was considered a spice, you say, kind of, were kept under lock and key because they were so expensive?
Yes. Oh, yes, absolutely. Even in the Elizabethan period, spices and the use of them indicated how wealthy you were.
Right, because they're coming from the East at great cost.
Absolutely. So if you had a highly spiced dish, it was an indication that you had the money to splurge on these wonderful sort of exotic ingredients.
Conspicuous confection.
Indeed, yeah.
Oh, so that explains in Romeo and Juliet, Lady Capulet tells the nurse to take her keys and fetch the spices.
Yeah.
So we're talking mace and nutmeg, cinnamon, and ginger. Okay, what
All
is
the good
mace
stuff.
anyway?
That's a mace, which is actually one of my favorite spices because it's so underused or underutilized in this day and age, is the outer casing of the nutmeg. So
I never knew that. It tastes like nutmeg. I mean, that makes sense.
It's similar. I think it's more citrusy than nutmeg, but it's a beautiful spice. We should use it more often, I think.
Huh. And also saffron was popular at this time.
Well, that is one of my all-time favourite spices. I've even written an entire book on English saffron. So it was in Shakespeare's day. It was widely grown in this country. We had a thriving saffron industry in England at the time that Shakespeare was writing. And it's mentioned a couple of times in his plays. The most famous one is in The Winter's Tale. I must have saffron to colour the Warden pies.
Right. I have to go back to sweeteners, though, to sugar, because is this era the beginning of the famed awful English teeth? Elizabeth I loved sweets and had allegedly, reportedly, just like brown stumps as she got older.
Yeah, I mean, I'm assuming that is true. I mean, it's hard to know sometimes when you read these texts whether it's propaganda. But yeah, I think that the richer you were, the more luxury ingredients you could afford, whether that's spices or sugar. So I know that there was a trend in her reign for gentlemen particularly to carry around silver toothpicks so that they could pick out morsels of food that were stuck between their teeth, or I'm guessing in the cavities of their teeth if they had rotted away from overconsumption of sugar.
Ugh.
I'm not entirely sure that dental hygiene was a high priority. If you were going to one of these sumptuous feasts where they were serving at the end, they had a course called a banquet, which is, again, another confusing thing with when we're talking about food from the early modern period, because a banquet actually referred to a standalone course, which consisted entirely or almost entirely of sweet things, so fruits that had been candied.
Oh, no, I have to ask you about this because it's so confusing. Like you said, there's a banquet, but then there's a banquet course, which is kind of like a dessert course, like you're saying, the sweet course. But didn't it happen in like a private little antechamber somewhere? And it's really all about getting you juiced up, kind of priming you for a dalliance.
Yes. So the banquets, as you can imagine, because they were serving stuff that had been candied or made with sugar, they were not the sort of thing you would want to invite everyone to anyway, because it would cost you a small fortune. So
it's like an intimate gathering.
I always say it's like the post-feast after party. You know, like when they have the Oscars and they go off to the after parties, and some people get invited to some parties and other people don't. It's kind of like that. So
the Vanity Fair party.
Absolutely. So you would go along and you would have all these wonderful sweet treats, but they would be served sometimes in just a side room. But some houses had entire buildings constructed for that purpose. So they would be sometimes in the garden. There's an account of Elizabeth, a house that she visited. They built like a little pavilion in the garden just for that purpose, for the banqueting course.
The banqueting house. I think they're in Henry VIII. The play. Doesn't Cardinal Wolsey arrange for a banquet course to be served in some privy chambers?
Yes, he does. And that is actually very much the implication there is that it's so he can entertain Anne Boleyn after the masque that she's been involved in. They're going to retire to this banqueting house or this area that has been set aside for that purpose. And they really did attract quite a lot of criticism from the Puritans of the day. There was one in particular, Philip Stubb, and he says something like, women will have their banqueting houses to play the filthy persons. I'm paraphrasing. I mean, it goes on. He rants for
filthy person.
He rants on for quite a period of time before he gets to that line. But it's all purely directed at women, which I find phenomenal because I suspect it was mostly driven by the men. I don't imagine the women were there saying, "Oh, come and see me in my private banqueting house." I imagine it was very much as it's depicted in Shakespeare's play Henry VIII. It's been set up by a man.
Always comes back to the slut shaming.
It does, unfortunately.
It's the sugar slut shaming version here.
Yeah.
And sugar was considered, what is it? It has hot and moist qualities that would promote lustful urges.
Yeah, no, that's very much the case. So it was, sugary things were not approved of by Philip Stubb. He would not have been eating gingerbreads and marchpane and quince marmalades or anything like that. He would
marchpane, that's marzipan, right?
That is marzipan, yeah. And again, an indication of how rare these treats were. There is in that scene in Romeo and Juliet, the servants are basically, one of them says, "Save me a bit of marchpane at the end if there's any left," because that's the only time they would have been able to sample things like marchpane because it was so expensive and also had expensive almonds in it as well.
So a lot of these things, as we said, spices and people, it's well known, are coming from foreign countries and from colonies at this point. And was anything coming from the recently colonized Americas to England yet during Shakespeare's time? For instance, there are references to turkeys.
Yes.
A couple of them in Shakespeare.
Well, that's the interesting thing because we have turkeys. We know they have potatoes. We've already mentioned that famous quote. And they weren't terribly popular at this point. And the potatoes we were eating were probably the sweet potato variety rather than white potatoes.
Oh, right. And you have a sweet potato pie recipe in the book.
Yeah. This is a classic example of where I've curtailed the recipe because you can't get cock sparrow brains, and I'm not suggesting for a minute that anyone goes out and kills lots of little tiny birds to put their brains in a pie, and eringo roots, of which we
for so many reasons that's not
for so
appetizing.
many reasons. So I've left those ingredients out. But yeah, the curious thing with chocolate and vanilla is, I suspect certainly vanilla I would expect us to be familiar with because I should think that would travel quite well. Chocolate's a curious one. It doesn't really take off here till the following century, so the 17th century. So there are no references that I've found in Shakespeare's plays directly to chocolate. I don't know why it took so long to take off in the UK. It really, you would think, given our relationship, because it was certainly known in Spain and Italy, in France, it's kind of weird that it didn't make a big impact here. I suspect it was known about, but it wasn't very popular in that period.
You mentioned how you have changed these recipes. For instance, you're not featuring bird brains. But how did you even develop the recipes, given that cookbooks at the time, they were so vague about measurements and quantities? Also, ovens, they're open fire. So how do you know the cooking times or
you don't. It's the
temperatures?
Simple answer. And quite often, if there are any references to quantities, they're huge quantities because these books were essentially written as aid memoirs for people cooking in large houses for lots of people.
16 pounds of lard.
Yeah, that sort of thing, yeah. So you take a recipe and they usually, they might say a handful of this. Well, my hand isn't necessarily going to be the same size as a cook's hand, especially if they're a male cook. So you have to kind of just use your judgment. I've cooked for most of my life and I've written about food and drink for a long time. So I just rely on my own expertise in that regard. But it's quite easy to adapt them and make them work in a modern kitchen. And I think they would be pretty faithful to the originals. The cooking method is different, though, I will agree, because obviously we have we have ovens now and we're not cooking over an open fire.
Well, that's always the thing, right? We don't really know what the food tasted like back then, really. I mean, do you have a sense also of whether ingredients were tastier than they are now or healthier since there were no pesticides or chemicals?
Well, I say at the beginning of the book, if you want to play devil's advocate, I would argue that no one can faithfully recreate the food from our past unless you get a time machine. And yes, to answer your question, things have changed. Even vegetables are completely different to what they would have been back then. I mean, carrots weren't orange, for example. They were purple. And I'm not even entirely sure we really would have had carrots per se. They would have had things like skirrets, which are kind of a bit like a carrot crossed with a parsnip.
Oh, that sounds good.
Yeah, but they wouldn't have been big like we have today. They would look quite weedy and insignificant compared to what we're used to today.
Like so the kind I grow.
Yeah.
Okay, everyone's going to get really mad at me unless we get to some recipes. And you start with bread in the book, which is wonderful because everyone ate it and ate it at probably every meal. So very democratic. Wealthier people, though, you say, you write, ate manchet bread. What was that like? Is that like brioche?
Not quite like brioche, although it does have some similarities insofar as quite a lot of the recipes you find are having milk in, sometimes eggs as well. So I suppose we're getting brioche-y, but it's
a richer white bread.
It's a richer, softer crumbed white bread. So it's a sort of the thing with the flour then is that to get it to be more pure, it had to be bolted multiple times or sieved multiple times. And in doing that, I mean, that was a labor-intensive process. So white flour was very expensive. That's not the sort of bread the everyday person was eating necessarily.
No, the everyday bread was called cheat bread.
Yes.
Why cheat bread?
Well, they had several kinds of everyday bread, but cheat bread was kind of the halfway house, if you like, between your fine manchet and your sort of coarsest bread that the really poor people ate. And it would have had a lot of the bran still included, but perhaps not quite so much as I said, the really rough bread that even gets referred to sometimes as horse bread, because it was the stuff that they would normally give to horses. But that's what people ate when they were either really poor or there's been a massively bad harvest and they were forced to eat.
So horse bread because it's made of like oats or other things,
the
barley that you'd give to a horse.
But yeah, cheap bread was kind of like your 1/4 white flour to 3/4 sort of brown flour. It's kind of funny really that nowadays we sort of hold high sort of wholemeal bread in higher esteem or higher regard than they would have done in those days.
Well, now we know why it's good for you to eat like a horse.
Yeah.
No, I didn't know until I read your book that dairy, like milk and butter and cheese, was called white meat for centuries before this early modern period. And it was considered food for the poor?
Yeah, well, this is, again, one of those tricky ones because, yes, it was considered food for the poor, but it also kind of goes back to these days where we weren't allowed to eat meat when we were a Catholic nation. I know there were periods like Lent where you weren't supposed to have dairy either, but they were certainly white meats were deemed to be the sort of thing you ate when you were restricting your diet and fasting in some way, even if it was just for a day. But they're also things like cheese were associated as being something the poor people ate. What's striking, though, in the cookbooks is you rarely find recipes containing cheese.
It's weird because people ate cheese, right, after meals as a course. And there are a lot of references to cheese in Shakespeare.
Well, this is what the confusing thing is. So if you look to the recipe books, you'd think we didn't eat cheese at all. So the assumption, I think, now with food historians is that it must have been eaten as a kind of standalone ingredient, as you say, at the end of a meal, perhaps, or as a meager meal, but it wasn't worth mentioning in a recipe book because you don't need a recipe for a chunk of cheese and a chunk of bread. So, yeah.
I think it was the Welsh parson, I forget his name. He looks forward to cheese and apples after his supper in the Merry Wives of Windsor.
Yeah, so the thing is with cheese, different nationalities are characterised by their love of certain foodstuffs, and the Welsh in Shakespeare's plays at least with the notable exception of the leeks in Henry IV, and I think both parts in Henry V. It's always cheese. The Welsh always seem to be mentioned in reference to cheese.
It's the Welsh are cheesy. Now, we've already talked a little bit about mutton, but I really love your recipe for lamb pears with barley. It just looks amazing. It's ground lamb that has been molded into the shape of pears, 2 pears.
Yeah.
And they're upright, vertical in a bath in a bowl of barley kind of super stew. But where does that idea come from? And was it common that these meat would be fashioned to look like something else?
Well, this goes back at least to the medieval period, probably earlier. But the idea of making this trompe l'oeil idea where you make a food to look like something that it isn't. So I think it's Henry IV had golden apples served at his coronation feast in 1399. They were apples that had been coated in a saffron-coloured batter to make them look golden. And then they had a leaf stuck in the top, and then the meatballs were poached, coated in a batter and dried in front of a fire, and they went to the table and they would look like apples. They would also sometimes coat them in like a green batter, so they literally look like apples. So this whole idea of as food as theatre as well, providing that added interest to a feast where you get a plate put in front of you and you're like, oh, a bowl of apples or a bowl of pears. Oh, no, they're not. They're meatballs.
I love it. If anybody listening makes this recipe, the lamb pears, please send us a photo. We'd love that. We'll reference you on a future podcast. What is a carbonado?
So a carbonado is like it's a grilled meat, effectively. So we were talking earlier about the fact that we didn't have, obviously they didn't have the sort of same equipment as we have nowadays to cook, but they did have the ability to grill, and they would put things in I believe almost like little cages, so they could hold them over the fire. So they would grill, and I'm imagining you would get the score lines like you would in a griddle pan today, because there's a reference in, again, I forget which play, but someone having their faces marked. They've been carbonadoed, right? Yeah, so that they've been scarred. So you can imagine that's how they did it. So it's a fancy way of saying grilled.
Right. I think the clown in All's Well kind of implies that Bertram's scarred face has been carbonaded. And there's another one in Coriolanus. This is from your book. He scotched him and notched him like a carbonado.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So your recipe is carbonado of veal or pork with verde sauce, green sauce,
that's
which
my
is
favorite
common.
sauce.
Oh,
yes.
Me too. Is it the kind of green sauce we know today? Kind of a vinegary one with lots of greens?
It's a wonderful sauce because it's got the fresh herbs, as you say, and you can vary those. I think I use predominantly mint and parsley. This version in the book has got garlic in it as well, but it's also got spices in it as well, a little bit of ginger, a little bit of pepper. So it's got that sort of piquancy there, and again, my favourite, saffron, which really makes the sauce pop. It really enhances the green colour. I know it sounds weird, but it really does enhance the green colour of the sauce. So it looks amazing and tastes amazing as well.
Interesting. You have a whole chapter on fresh vegetables and salad, and I just don't associate early modern British cooking with those courses, those dishes, but they were common. Of course, people were eating out of their gardens, right?
Yeah, and again, it's not something you necessarily find a lot of recipes for, because I think it was kind of just given that you would eat. I mean, they definitely ate salads. If you look at the herbals of the day, which is sort of like more of the medical books, less recipe-led, but more medical treatises that were produced by people like John Gerard, they mention, in fact, John Gerard wrote A Cetaria, which is a whole book devoted to salads. So that just goes to show how important they were. But it was something you could throw together if you had a cottage garden. They were very good thought would be quite good for you. And it was just given that you would serve them with oil and vinegar. I mean, you didn't need a recipe, much in the same way as you kind of don't really need a recipe today to just do a green salad.
Well, no offense, but what happened to British cooking? The salads and the fresh vegetables seem to have vanished for a couple of centuries.
Yeah, we could talk about that one again. That was another whole podcast. I don't know why. I mean, I think our cookery gets a bad rap from rationing in World War II, which is a long, post-war. I mean, and I think there was, I may be wrong here, but I believe someone like Mrs. Beeton suggested you boil sprouts or cabbage for like half an hour. But again, varieties were probably different. Who's to say that what the words Brussels sprouts and the cabbages we get today, maybe they're
less
tenderer.
tough. Maybe
less tough.
Yeah, tenderer.
Yeah, who's to say? So, yeah.
You've hosted Shakespeare supper clubs.
Yeah.
Do you have a privy chamber?
No, I don't. Philip Sub wouldn't approve, would he? No, I don't. No, I used to do them from my house before COVID. I would host dinners for, up to 12 people. I don't have a massive house, so I couldn't have like massive banqueting tables full of loads of people. But yeah, they were good fun to do, really good fun to do, and always incredibly popular.
Well, it's so fun. Maybe to send us off, since it's the holidays, you could suggest a recipe that someone could make for a holiday gathering?
Well, I know they're not particularly big in the US, but mince pies, because I feel
you
that
make the case, please.
I feel that the traditional mince pie should make a comeback, because even in this country, we no longer put meat in our mince pie. And I mentioned it earlier, but originally it was classically a mixture of meat, usually mutton, but sometimes beef. And it's mixed with some dried fruits, teensy bit of sugar, but again, more like a spice than anything else, because the fruits are quite sweet in themselves, and spices. And actually, people pull a face, but I always say, imagine eating a North African tagine.
Well,
it's
exactly.
Kind of the same
or you
vibe.
Make it sound like a really delicious empanada.
Yeah, it's exactly. I think if you make the analogy with something that people are familiar with today, the ick factor goes.
Okay, you convinced me. That's great. Mince pies for all.
Mince pies, yeah.
Thank you so much, Sam. It was just really delightful to talk with you, and I love the book.
Oh, thank you very much. I'm glad you like it.
That was Sam Bilton, interviewed by Barbara Bogave. Much Ado About Cooking, Delicious Shakespearean Feasts for Every Occasion is out now from Shakespeare's Globe and Headline Publishing. This episode was produced by Matt Frasica. Garland Scott is the executive producer. It was edited by Gail Kern-Pastor. We had technical help from Melis Uslu in London and Voice Tracks West in Studio City, California. Our web producer is Paula Garcia Acuna. Leonora Fernandez edits our transcripts. Final mixing services provided by Clean Cuts at 3Cs Inc. If you're a fan of Shakespeare Unlimited, please spread the word. Tell a friend about why you love the podcast. Shakespeare Unlimited comes to you from the Folger Shakespeare Library. Home to the world's largest Shakespeare collection, the Folger is dedicated to advancing knowledge and the arts. If you're in Washington, D.C., come visit the Folger on Capitol Hill. Come face-to-face with a Shakespeare First Folio in our exhibition halls, or take in a play in our theater. Or enjoy our Quill and Crumb Cafe. We'd love to see you. For more information, visit our website, folger.edu. Until next time, thanks for listening.